Hey guys, tonight we are going to pull back the curtain of history to witness the final days of a legend, William the Conqueror. Often remembered as a giant of willpower and strength, William was the Duke who achieved the impossible, crossing the Channel, crushing every enemy, and crowning himself King of England. However, the story we listen to tonight is not about triumph, but about a terrifying downfall where his worldly power could not save him from an invisible enemy. In the summer of 1087, his own great body became his prison and his end. A small accident during an act of revenge led to a terrible rot from within, turning William's final days into a fetid nightmare. The stench of death emanating from the dying king became so unbearable that it overcame even loyalty, forcing his attendants to cover their faces and flee. This is the story of how the greatest of conquerors was in turn conquered by bacteria and the decomposition of his own flesh. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please let me know where you are relaxing and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1187, within the cold stone walls of the Saint Gervais at Saint Protais Monastery at Rouen, a horrific stench spread through the corridors. This odour did not arise from a long-forgotten corpse or a hidden plague pit, but from the living body of one of medieval Europe's most powerful figures, William I, Duke of Normandy, the man who had crossed the English Channel and claimed the English crown by blood and iron. His massive frame, once likened to an impregnable fortress, was now rotting away from within. Each breath he drew tortured by decay, and the noxious fumes so overwhelming that even his most loyal servants fled in terror. William I was born in the year 126, the illegitimate son of Robert, Duke of Normandy. Over decades of warfare, he carved out his authority. At the age of 24, he quelled rebellions and consolidated his rule in Normandy. At the age of 38, he crossed the Channel, defeated King Harold II on the fields of Hastings, and was crowned King of England on or about the 14th of November in the year 105. His renown spread across the continent, a master strategist and warrior who led armies with sword and unyielding discipline. Yet in the summer of 1187, when he was near 60 years old, a medieval way of indicating 59, William might have believed himself prepared to retire from war to enjoy the peace of old age. Fate, however, intervened with a far more terrible end, not on the battlefield, but within the sanctity of a monastery, long revered as a place of serenity and spiritual refuge. The tragedy began with a deep wound to his pride. Philip IV of France, nicknamed Leafbeard, mocked William for his corpulence, likening the aging duke to a pregnant woman. Such scorn struck at William's warrior's honour, and he vowed vengeance. In July of 1187, he led his Norman forces to besiege the town of Mantes, some 12 miles from Rouen. Under his command, the troops encircled Mantes, pressed the townspeople with spears and crossbows, and ultimately set fire to its fortifications and homes. Smoke and flame roared into the summer sky, screams of the inhabitants reverberated through the streets, and the scene of destruction formed a grim backdrop to William's martial display. Mounted on his warhorse, William charged into the inferno, the iron pommel of his saddle glinting in the sunlight, a vivid testament to his unconquerable might. He rode at the head of his men, surveying the town consumed by flames, a brutal yet breathtaking spectacle that emblazoned the title, the Conqueror, in the minds of soldiers and subjects alike. And yet, amid the triumph, a weariness flickered in William's heart. Had the ceaseless victories left him bereft of passion for conquest? Before he could withdraw to celebrate, calamity struck. As he guided his horse across the rubble, the animal suddenly reared. Some chroniclers say it stepped on a glowing ember from a collapsing building. Others claim it was startled by a sudden crash. In the ensuing chaos, William's substantial frame was thrown against the iron pommel. The horn of the saddle drove deep into his abdomen, rupturing organs and tearing internal tissues. The pain was instantaneous and excruciating, like 1,000 needles piercing him all at once. He collapsed in his saddle, clutching his belly, his face drained of colour as he gasped for air. The Duke's attendants rushed to his side, dismounting him and carrying him to a nearby field tent. Yet the physicians of the 11th century could not diagnose his hidden wound. There was no visible blood, no external laceration, only an agonizing awareness that something inside had been cruelly torn. William, ever proud, bore his suffering in silence to avoid demoralizing his troops, and ordered that he be transported back to the Saint Gervais et Saint Protais monastery at Rouen for proper care. The journey back proved torturous. Each jolt of the litter thrust waves of agony through his bowels. By the time they reached the monastery walls, he was delirious with fever, his skin pale and clammy. The resident physicians resorted to every known medieval remedy: bloodletting to balance the humours, application of cupping, glass discs to draw out bad blood, poultices of fragrant oils and crushed herbs, and fervent prayers for divine healing. Nothing alleviated his suffering. Within less than a week, his abdomen began to swell grotesquely, distending like a bloated gourd. The internal wound had allowed intestinal bacteria to invade his body cavity, setting off peritonitis and gangrene. In those early days, William believed his ordeal merely a harsh physical trial. He could not foresee that this concealed injury would usher in a dreadful decay, his flesh rotting while still alive, each breath a reminder of creeping death. The stench soon became undeniable, a rancid miasma that seeped through the monastery's corridors, heralding a tragedy so profound that all who witnessed it would forever be haunted by the memory. At the very moment William was asserting his dominance in the midst of the burning streets, his warhorse suddenly reared violently. Chroniclers of the time would later suggest a few possible causes. Perhaps the horse stepped on a glowing ember that had fallen from a collapsing rooftop, or perhaps it was startled by the crash of tumbling masonry. Whatever the trigger, the powerful destrier jerked forward with such force that William's great bulk was thrown rearward against the iron pommel of his saddle. The hard horn of the pommel drove deep into his swollen abdomen, rupturing his intestines and causing grievous internal injuries. The pain, sudden and blinding, struck him like a lance, and he collapsed in his saddle, clutching his midsection and gasping for breath. The Duke's guards, alarmed and anxious, hurried to his side, carefully dismounting him and carrying him to the nearest field tent, which served as a makeshift medical station. Yet, in the 11th century, a wound of this nature, seemingly invisible from the outside, was all but hopeless. There was no external laceration, no spurting blood to guide the physician's hands, only an agonizing, persistent ache that radiated throughout his body. William, ever the stoic commander, refused to betray any sign of weakness before his troops. With measured composure, he ordered that he be transported back to Rouen immediately for proper care. The journey to the Saint Gervais et Saint Protais monastery became a grim ordeal. Each jolt of the litter intensified the ruthless cramping in his abdomen, as though unseen hands were twisting his entrails every time he was moved. By the time the procession reached the monastery's gates, William was feverish and disoriented, his mind drifting between bouts of pain and delirium. In that cool, dimly lit cloister, the monks and physicians prepared their humours and tinctures, determined to restore him to health. They employed every known remedy of the age: bloodletting to rebalance his humours, cupping with heated glass discs applied to his flanks, herbal poultices of comfrey and willow to draw out corruptions, and fervent prayers chanted in the heavy silence of the chapel. Yet none of these interventions stemmed the tide of suffering. Within merely a few days, William's abdomen began to swell grotesquely, distending like a dark, bruised bladder beneath his surcoat. Modern physicians would describe his condition as acute peritonitis followed by gangrene, his ruptured intestines spewing bacteria into his body cavity, where flesh and tissue began to decay, even as life still animated him. In those early, agonizing mornings, William lay motionless on his pallet, his breath shallow and ragged. The monks draped him in sheets soaked with vinegar and lavender, hoping to mask the burgeoning stench of decomposition. But such measures were futile. The infection spread relentlessly, inflaming and mortifying the walls of his abdomen until patches of skin turned from red to purple to black. Each exhalation from his gaping maw released a wisp of sulphurous air, as if his very breath carried the essence of rot. He could feel the sickness spreading in waves, a viscous tide that no incantation or salve could repel. Despite the ceaseless agony, William's spirit clung to the edge of consciousness. He would awaken in quiet intervals, his eyes flickering open to glimpse the worried faces of attendants hovering at his bedside. Their worry was mingled with horror. Even the bravest among them flinched at the sight of his distended belly and the dark weeping sores beginning to crust at the corners. William raised his hand weakly, signaling them to lower their voices, unwilling even in torment to disturb the solemn hush of the monastery. As days drifted into nights, the pattern of medieval treatment grew ever more desperate. The physicians, having exhausted familiar remedies, resorted to prayers and exorcisms, beseeching divine intervention to halt the ravaging plague within his flesh. They recited litanies of saints, sprinkled holy water, and anointed him with chrism oil in hopes of driving out the miasma. But the bacteria, unseen and merciless, continued their silent siege, reducing organ after organ to slime and gas. The swelling increased, so taut and engorged that even the slightest movement caused a sickening pop of tissue under tension. William's world narrowed to the narrow confines of his straw-filled mattress, the sounds of chanting monks and the distant clatter of feet in woolen slippers blending into a lullaby of sorrow. In his lucid moments, he wept softly for the soldiers he would never lead again, for the realm he would not see secure, and for the simple comfort of untroubled rest that death itself now refused to grant him. Yet, true to his indomitable nature, he strove to mask his pain, forcing a calm facade whenever a visitor crossed the threshold. Finally, the initial phase of his silent rot reached a dreadful crescendo. The bacterial invasion had eaten through his peritoneum, and the toxins in his bloodstream surged, triggering delirium and fever dreams that blurred the line between waking and sleep. William drifted in and out of consciousness, senses dulled by the relentless throb of internal decay. The monastery's corridors were now heavy with his scent, a lurid reminder that even the greatest among men could be felled by a wound unseen, his glory eclipsed by the inexorable force of nature's smallest agents. And so the conqueror's proud and powerful frame lay broken, the once unyielding duke transformed into a vessel of corruption, as the world outside continued its rhythm of war and prayer, seldom pausing to acknowledge that within those stone walls, one of history's mightiest conquerors was rotting alive, his legacy slipping away with each tortured breath. The misery that befell William multiplied manyfold as the putrid stench of his rotting abdomen spread through the chamber. At first, his attendants, those loyal souls who had long served him on campaign, pressed damp cloths, steeped in vinegar, and crushed herbs against their faces, striving to stifle the overwhelming odor. Yet the miasma proved too potent. One by one they reeled in nausea, retching violently before stumbling out into the corridor, some even refusing to return. The Duke now lay prostrate upon his pallet, his skin ashen and wan, while dark, gangrenous patches festered across his swollen belly. In the stillness, he could hear the echo of hurried footsteps and whispered curses each time a servant fled in horror. Medieval chroniclers record that his anguished cries, raw, unfiltered howls of pain resounded throughout the monastery, striking terror even into the hearts of high-ranking prelates who drifted in and out of sight behind cloistered columns. Day by day, William's suffering intensified, not solely in body but in spirit. Here was the warrior who had once bent kingdoms to his will, now powerless against an invisible foe. Bacteria, those smallest of adversaries, ravaged his flesh from within, defying every stratagem of sword and shield he had ever employed. His pride, once a fortress of steel, crumbled inch by inch, leaving only the raw nerve of despair. In those rare, lucid moments, he wept softly, tears mingling with fevered sweat, for he understood that no blade could counter this microscopic enemy, and no siegecraft could reclaim his failing health. Gone was the fierce resolve that had driven him to victory at Hastings. In its place lay a profound, crushing helplessness. He thought of past insults and rivalries, his bitter feud with his elder brother, the rebellions crushed beneath Norman lances, even the taunting nickname William the Bastard hurled at him in his youth. Now such slights seemed trivial compared to the indignity of being devoured by decay. The moniker, the Conqueror, once a badge of honor, now rang hollow in his ears as he lay confined by the very flesh he once so proudly commanded. Each labored breath brought fresh agony, and each heartbeat echoed the slow unraveling of his body's defenses. He longed not for triumph, but for oblivion, for the release of death to end this living nightmare. The monastery's physicians, aged men in blood-matted robes, continued their ministrations, though with ever-diminishing hope. They moistened his lips with rosewater, poured bitter tinctures down his throat, and applied unguents of mint and myrtle to the darkening lesions. Occasionally, a monk would pause by his side to whisper a prayer or press a crucifix against his forehead, beseeching divine mercy. Yet even the scent of incense did little to banish the underlying stench of corruption. William's eyes, once bright with martial purpose, now reflected only the flicker of candlelight and the dimming ember of his own mortality. As nights passed into days, the households beyond the cloister walls grew uneasy. Rumours of the Duke's fate spread among the people of Rouen, tales of a great ruler rotting alive behind monastery doors, his screams rattling ancient stones. Some whispered that God himself had delivered judgment upon William for his ruthless campaigns in England, while others speculated that he had incurred the wrath of saints whose churches he had razed. There were even murmurs that his own sin had incarnated as this vile decay, an ecclesiastical commentary on the horrors of war and pride. Inside the chamber, William felt as though he were suspended between life and death, neither fully living nor entirely gone. He drifted in a haze of fever dreams, haunted by visions of fields shimmering with blood and flames licking at his feet. Yet whenever consciousness returned, the reality of his rotting flesh would strike him anew, anchoring him in a suffering so absolute that it eclipsed any dream. He yearned for the gentle darkness of sleep, but even that reprieve eluded him, for the pain always lingered at the edge of his mind, a relentless reminder of his creeping mortality. In the final hours of that tortured vigil, William's thoughts turned inward. He no longer roused his men or strode across battlefields. Instead, he confronted the limits of his own flesh. The plague of gangrene had stripped away every layer of dignity, reducing him to a vessel of putrefaction. And yet, beneath the despair, there shone a faint ember of resignation, an acceptance that even the mightiest conqueror must one day yield to the inexorable law of decay. With that realization, his spirit, battered but unbowed, braced itself for the ultimate surrender. The torment that beset William did not end there. Word of his slow, agonizing death and the appalling stench of decay spread rapidly throughout the monastery and into the surrounding district of Rouen. Even the Duke's most stalwart attendants, once unflinching in battle, found themselves recoiling at the fetid air that seeped from his chamber. One by one they fled, preferring the threat of punishment over another moment spent amid the rank miasma. William, a king whom all had revered, now lay utterly alone save for a handful of physicians and 2 or 3 steadfast priests who still dared to enter. Opportunists soon circled like vultures. The king's private quarters, overflowing with the plunder of a lifetime of conquest gold chains, gem-encrusted daggers, embroidered silks, intricately carved chalices presented a tempting spectacle. At first, only trifles vanished. A jewelled ring here, a fine brocade sash there. But emboldened by the absence of consequence, thieves grew bolder. Masking their noses with cloths soaked in vinegar, they crept in on silent feet, snatched valuables in handfuls, and vanished into the corridors. Orderic Vitalis, one of William's chroniclers, recorded with horror that some looters even laughed as they divided their spoils, heedless of the rotting sovereign sprawled on the floor. It was perhaps the ultimate indignity. A king who had once ordered entire cities torched, now denied dignity even in death, his treasures plundered while he stank of corruption. Amid such degradation, William sought the solace of his faith. Priests and monks approached his pallet, bearing crosses and holy books, chanting prayers to commend his soul to paradise. Yet even these men of God could barely withstand the reek. They would utter hurried absolutions and scrawl vestigial rites in Latin before retreating to gasp for fresh air. In the handful of minutes they spent by his side, they heard his confession's burdened admissions of the cruelties he had unleashed. Most poignant was his confession of the so-called harrowing of the North in the year 1069, a campaign that starvation and slaughter had reduced some 100,000 Englishmen, women, and children to corpses. He spoke also of countless villages he had razed, rebellions he had crushed with iron and fire, and even personal betrayals. Nephews and cousins caught in the crossfire of his ambition. Through ragged sobs, William wept for those he had wronged a warrior king at last, humbled by the cruelty of his own making. In these moments of penitence, he revealed a vulnerability unseen in his years of martial glory. No longer could he brandish a sword or deploy a battalion to intimidate. No strategy could staunch the creeping rot within him. He was utterly exposed, stripped of pretense, bearing his repentance at the threshold of death. It was a scene of profound pathos. The the conqueror reduced to a penitent, his tears staining the blood-soaked sheets, his voice scarcely more than a whisper against the drone of incense and the crackle of candle flames. As days passed, the handful of loyal clergy and physicians became his sole link to the world he once commanded. They administered what little care they could, cooling compresses of rosewater to ease his fever, tinctures of lavender to calm his delirium, and measured doses of opiates to dull the pain. Yet each temporary relief gave way to another wave of nausea and despair. William's body continued its grim transformation, the wounds beneath his skin rotting in a darkness no light could penetrate. The mosaics of the chapel, once a source of wonder, now served as a backdrop to his suffering. Each time a candle guttered in the draught, he felt a shudder of dread. Was that the breath of heaven or the exhalation of his own decay? Outside the monastery, tales of the king's demise grew in the telling. Some painted him as a martyr, felled by divine vengeance for his sins. Others saw in his fate a cautionary tale for all who relied on force and cruelty. Rumours spoke of a cold wind that seemed to rise from his chamber, carrying his stench into the town markets. Mothers warned children to stay clear of the fortress gates. Merchants rebuffed collectors of tribute as if fearing the curse of his rotting flesh. In the hush of night, the cathedral bells tolled for William's approaching end. Each chime a sombre reminder that no crown could shield its wearer from the ravages of disease and time. Through it all, William's spirit clung to a final hope, that even in death, his confession and contrition might secure his salvation. He sought to atone for the countless lives shattered by his campaigns, to leave behind something more enduring than castles and surveys. And as the last vestiges of strength ebbed from his battered form, he prayed not for victory on the battlefield, but for mercy in the world. Beyond a silent plea floated on the thin, acrid air of his chamber, a final testament to a king undone by the very flesh he had once wielded as a weapon. On the morning of September 9th, 1087, as the bells of Rouen Cathedral rang out for dawn prayers, William I drew his final breath. After weeks of excruciating torment, his passing was almost merciful in its suddenness, a fleeting relief compared to the drawn-out agony that had preceded it. Yet, even in death, his disgrace persisted. Those who remained at his side, few in number, ultimately could not bear the horror of the stench any longer. One by one they fled the chamber, abandoning the duke's decomposing body amid the fetid air that still clung to the stone walls. What followed was intended to be a solemn royal funeral, but it quickly descended into farce and calamity. The corpse was so rife with decay that traditional washing and embalming were impossible. No bath of scented water could quell the rank odour. No rites of perfumed anointing could mask the rot. Finally, a local knight named Harrowing, doubtless motivated by the promise of generous recompense, agreed to oversee the rudimentary preparations. The body was placed into a lead-lined coffin, the walls of which were thought to contain the worst of the reek. Strips of cloth soaked in wine and spices were wrapped around the limbs, while pungent herbs were stuffed into the cavities in a desperate attempt to staunch the foul effluvia. At last, the funeral procession set out across the rolling countryside of Normandy towards Seine, where William had founded the Abbaye aux Hommes and requested interment. But the effort to contain the smell proved vain. As the wagon creaked along dirt roads, the putrid fumes seeped through the lead seams, trailing behind like a miasmic banner. Villagers who had gathered to pay respects found themselves gagging and clustering at a fearful distance. Even the hounds of their flocks howled and fled, driven away by what they undoubtedly perceived as a supernatural threat. Midway through the journey, near the town of Caen, a fire broke out, whether accidental or ignited by carelessness is lost to history, and smoke thickened the air. The funeral party was forced to halt for several hours while the blaze was extinguished. In that unexpected delay, the heat of the late summer sun accelerated the process of decomposition within the sealed coffin. Gases built up inside the lead lining, inflating the corpse like a grotesque balloon. By the time the procession reached the gates of the Abbaye aux Hommes, the coffin was taut, its contents threatening to burst forth at any moment. Inside the abbey's chapel, a throng of clergy, nobles, and foreign envoys had assembled to honour the fallen conqueror. The lead coffin was solemnly carried down the stone aisle and placed before the awaiting sarcophagus, its ornate lid poised for the final transfer of the body. Yet when the pallbearers attempted to open the coffin, the first gasp of rancid air was like a malevolent spirit unleashed. A wave of nausea swept through the congregation. Some cowered in horror, others wretched on the cold floor. The rich tapestries and carved oak panels, once symbols of ecclesiastical grandeur, now bore witness to a scene of utter degradation. In a panic, the pallbearers forced the remains from the lead coffin into the stone sarcophagus. But the bloated forms, swollen by decomposition gases, would not fit. With increasing desperation, they pressed and prodded, trying to compress the body into the narrow tomb. Then, with a sickening finality, William's abdomen ruptured. A blast of putrescence erupted, splattering the marble walls and pooling on the stone floor. It was as if the gates of hell, to borrow Orderic Vitalis's vivid phrase, had opened within the hallowed space. A dark cloud of stench swirled upward, enveloping the high altar and driving even the most devout clergy into flight. Within moments, the once solemn burial service descended into utter chaos. Priests abandoned their Latin chants mid-verse, stumbling backward in their vestments, convulsed by retching. Bishops and barons, their fine silks ruined by vomit, staggered toward the nearest exits. Attendants seized the body and shoved it into the sarcophagus as quickly as possible, though it still did not lie flat. Mortar was hastily applied to seal the lid, while stone slabs were dropped into place with resounding clanks. The few stonemasons remaining dug in, sealing every crack to trap the stench, retreating in relays to catch fresh air. And so ended the funeral of William I, not with the grace and reverence befitting a monarch, but with a desperate scramble to escape the horror that he had become. No eulogies were delivered, no processions wound through the streets of Caen. Instead, there were only whispered prayers of deliverance and the final echo of mortar pounding on stone. The Conqueror, once hailed as a master of war and statecraft, was interred amidst confusion and disgrace. In the annals of medieval Europe, this burial is remembered not for its pageantry, but for its grotesque finale. The man who had shaped the destiny of two kingdoms was laid to rest in the most ignominious fashion imaginable, his rotting flesh serving as a stark reminder that no power on earth can defy the march of decay. As the last echoes of the hastily concluded rites faded, the stunned survivors filed out into the afternoon light, forever haunted by the memory of a king laid low by the smallest of enemies, bacteria and time. In the wake of the sarcophagus's explosive failure in the Abbey Church, William's death transcended mere medical tragedy and was swiftly interpreted as divine judgment. Preachers and religious commentators ever attentive to signs sent from heaven declaimed from pulpits that the Conqueror had suffered the ultimate humiliation before burial. The rotting of his living flesh symbolized a punishment for his most arrogant sins. They spoke most pointedly of the harrowing of the North in the year 1069, a campaign of such ruthless devastation that contemporary estimates place the death toll at approximately 100,000 civilians. To these clerics, such wanton destruction of villages, farms, and families had provoked God's ire. The same Lord who granted victory could also exact retribution. Sermons and public debates across Normandy and England held William up as a cautionary example. No matter how vast one's earthly power, pride could precipitate a precipitous fall when it ran counter to divine will. Politically, the gruesome nature of William's death added fuel to an already volatile succession crisis. Rumours of the disastrous funeral procession reached William Rufus, William's second son and the new King of England, and stirred within him a profound reluctance to assume control of Normandy as well. He feared that the taint of his father's ignoble end would mar his own rule in the duchy. Meanwhile, Robert William's firstborn, whose relationship with his father had been marked by alternating rebellion and reconciliation, found his inheritance declared in the fevered delirium of the dying king. Robert was designated to receive Normandy, while William Rufus was to take the English throne. The third son, Henry, was left only a monetary allowance. These arrangements, made under the grip of pain and delirium, sowed confusion and distrust among the Norman nobility. Noble factions, already wary of the emerging partition, seized upon the macabre details of the funeral as justification for resisting the new order. Some barons whispered that a leader whose final moments were so heavily marked by decay could bring a curse upon his domain. Others, less concerned with spiritual omens, saw an opportunity to expand their own holdings, betting on which prince might ultimately prevail. The perceived weakness of William Rufus, rife with doubts about inheriting Normandy, encouraged ambitious nobles to hedge their bets, aligning themselves with Robert or even considering alliances with the King of France. What began as a father's tragic end thus rippled outward, destabilizing the delicate equilibrium of power that William the First had spent a lifetime establishing. Across Normandy, a palpable sense of uncertainty took hold. Cities like Rouen and Caen, once centers of Norman authority, felt the tremors of factional plotting. Merchants counted the cost of interrupted trade routes, while peasant communities feared the prospect of renewed skirmishes over territorial claims. The estates of minor lords changed hands in hurried, often violent exchanges as opportunists moved to secure assets amid the confusion. Meanwhile, King William Rufus hesitated to press his own claim on Normandy, fearful that association with his father's disgrace would undermine his legitimacy. Rather than consolidating his father's vast realm, he focused on shoring up his English holdings, leaving Normandy to the intrigues of Robert and their mutual supporters. This period of turbulence, sparked by William's grotesque demise, thus inaugurated a protracted era of rivalry and intermittent conflict between brothers. The Duchy of Normandy and the Kingdom of England, once under a single strong ruler, now stood divided, each fragment under the leadership of a prince unsure of his own inheritance. Over the ensuing decades, this division precipitated wars of succession, shifting alliances with the King of France, and repeated skirmishes on both sides of the Channel. Historians note that the Norman realm would not fully stabilize until the mid-11th century's close, when a new generation of leaders emerged. In sum, William I's catastrophic end at Rouen was more than a sensational footnote in medieval chronicles. It was a catalyst for political upheaval. His sons, thrust into power amid scandal and suspicion, inherited not only his lands, but also the consequences of his ignominious death. The macabre procession that echoed through Normandy became an omen for a realm riven by divided loyalties, fear of divine wrath, and the relentless ambition of nobles seeking advantage. Thus, a tragedy of flesh and decay ultimately paved the way for a prolonged struggle that would shape the destiny of both England and Normandy for generations to come. Monumental though it was in its day, William's tomb at the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen endured a succession of indignities in the centuries that followed. In the year 1522, during extensive restoration works at the abbey, workers opened the tomb and discovered only scattered fragments of bone, far fewer than expected for a king. These remains, tiny pieces of rib, vertebra, and skull, were hastily reinterred, but the sense of desecration lingered. Then, some 40 years later in 1562, the wars of religion racked Normandy. Calvinist forces, seeking to purge symbols of Catholic authority, ransacked the abbey church and defiled many tombs, including William's. According to surviving accounts, looters broke open the lead-lined coffin and scattered what little was left of the ducal remains. Only a single femur was rescued by a local monk, who wrapped it in cloth and secreted it away for safekeeping. It was not until the 19th century, some 760 years after William's death, that the Abbaye aux Hommes underwent yet another phase of reconstruction. As part of the renovation completed in the year 1847, a new sarcophagus was commissioned and placed beneath the choir screen. Yet, despite the elaborate stonework and carved inscriptions celebrating the Conqueror's legacy, the coffin contained only that solitary thigh bone, encased in a small, lead-lined casket. Visitors marveled at the irony. The man who had stretched his power from Hastings to Sicily was now represented by a single fragment of his skeleton. That tiny bone, cramped within its narrow container, served as a stark reminder of how even the greatest triumphs can be reduced to mere echoes over time. From the perspective of modern medicine, the sequence of events that befell William in September of the year 1087 can be understood in startling clarity. The initial injury, a violent collision between his abdomen and the iron pommel of his saddle, likely caused rupture of major internal organs. His small intestines, spleen, and possibly portions of his liver would have been torn, allowing gut flora to infiltrate the normally sterile peritoneal cavity. Once these bacteria, principally species of Escherichia, Clostridium, and Bacteroides, gained entry, an acute peritonitis ensued. This inflammation of the abdominal lining quickly progressed to wet gangrene, wherein bacterial enzymes and toxins produce extensive tissue necrosis and fluid accumulation. Complicating matters further was the phenomenon of gas gangrene, mostly induced by Clostridium perfringens. These anaerobic bacteria thrive in oxygen-poor environments and generate hydrogen and carbon dioxide gases as metabolic byproducts. Within the confines of William's distended abdomen, gases built up pressure, causing the overlying skin and abdominal wall to bloat and discolor. Historians note the skin turned from ruddy to purple-black in blotches, before finally exhibiting taut, shining patches as the swelling intensified. Under the heat and humidity of a Norman summer, these processes accelerated dramatically. William's considerable body fat, once a symbol of his wealth and power, unwittingly provided an ideal medium for bacterial proliferation. Adipose tissue offers both a reservoir of nutrients and relative ease of bacterial invasion, owing to its lower blood supply and less robust immune surveillance compared to muscle. Once the bacteria established a foothold, they secreted toxins such as alpha toxin and theta toxin, which lysed cell membranes and disrupted local blood flow. The result was a vicious cycle of ischemia, necrosis, and further bacterial expansion. As the bacterial load soared, the breakdown of proteins released foul-smelling compounds, notably putrescine and cadaverine. These diamines are notorious for their pungent odor, described by chemists as the quintessential smell of decay. In the medieval era, few remedies could counteract such noxious emissions. Vinegar, herbs, and incense offered only marginal relief against the powerful aromatic signature of rotting flesh. The miasma that pervaded William's chamber was thus a chemical onslaught that modern antiseptics or antibiotics might have neutralized, but which in the 11th century remained entirely beyond cure. Even if William had survived the initial trauma, the ensuing systemic infection would have rapidly led to septic shock. In the absence of intravenous fluids, vasopressors, or surgical debridement, his body's defenses could never regain control. His fever, delirium, and ultimate collapse were all predictable endpoints once peritonitis took hold. The characteristic swelling, discoloration, and accumulation of gas within tissues align precisely with contemporary descriptions of his condition. Thus, from a 21st century viewpoint, William's end appears almost inevitable once his saddle pommel drove into his belly. The combined forces of peritonitis, wet and gas gangrene, and septicemia create a medical cascade that is uniformly fatal without prompt and advanced intervention. His obesity, once part of his identity as a powerful monarch, proved to be an exacerbating factor, as abundant fatty tissues fueled bacterial growth and hindered effective immune response. In sum, the physical remains, or the near absence thereof at the Abajo Homs, echo the tragic trajectory of William I's final days. The single thigh bone in its diminutive lead casket stands as a testament to the limitations of medieval medicine, the perils of battlefield injuries, and the relentless efficiency of bacterial pathogens. Behind the grandeur of Norman rule, these scientific insights underscore how even history's mightiest rulers remain vulnerable to the smallest of invaders, the microbes that have shaped human fate since time immemorial. From the vantage point of 21st century medicine, William's fate might have unfolded very differently. The internal lacerations inflicted by the iron saddle pommel tearing through intestine, spleen, and perhaps even the liver would today be identified on imaging studies almost immediately. In a modern hospital setting, an emergency laparotomy could excavate the necrotic tissue, irrigate the peritoneal cavity, and repair any perforations. Surgeons, operating under sterile conditions and guided by advanced anesthesia, would excise devitalized bowel and control bleeding. With post-operative intensive care monitoring vital signs and fluid balance, the risk of overwhelming infection would be greatly reduced. Moreover, the introduction of broad-spectrum antibiotics agents, such as a third-generation cephalosporin, combined with metronidazole, and perhaps an agent to cover resistant organisms, would arrest the progression of peritonitis. Intravenous antibiotics, administered within the first hour of recognition of intra-abdominal sepsis, could halt bacterial proliferation. In William's case, the most likely culprits would be Clostridium species, causing gas gangrene, and a variety of gram-negative organisms driving wet gangrene. Modern laboratory diagnostics would identify specific pathogens through cultures of peritoneal fluid and blood, allowing de-escalation to targeted antimicrobial therapy. The combination of surgical debridement and antibiotics would almost certainly have saved him from the living rot that consumed him in 1187. Even the initial injury, a closed wound invisible exteriorly, would not condemn a patient today. Advancements in trauma care, including focused assessment with sonography for trauma, FAST, and computed tomography scans, can detect free air or fluid in the abdomen within minutes. A trauma team, equipped with damage control surgery protocols, would stabilize him rapidly. Where William endured days of unrecognized internal bleeding and ongoing contamination, a modern protocol would diagnose and treat him as a Class 5 on the Mannheim Peritonitis Index, but with a survival rate well above 50%, even in the presence of hypotension and tachycardia. Yet beyond the clinical interventions lies the more profound horror William endured, the mental trauma of perceiving one's own body as a battleground against invisible invaders. For a medieval warrior accustomed to confronting armored foes and enemy armies, the notion of an unseen bacterial legion lay beyond comprehension. Today, we recognize such an experience could provoke acute stress reactions, even post-traumatic stress disorder, as patients grapple with the realization that their own flesh has become an adversary. Modern medicine acknowledges this psychological dimension. Critical care units employ pain management protocols, including opioid infusions and sedatives, as well as early engagement of psychiatric liaison teams or psychologists to support patients confronting profound physical betrayal. William's condition, marked by peritonitis and 2 varieties of gangrene, wet and gas, would have produced both pain and a growing terror. Gas gangrene, characterized by the rapid production of gases such as hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide within tissues, leads to exquisite pain out of proportion to physical findings. The delivery of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a modern adjunct, could also inhibit anaerobic bacterial growth and support tissue salvage. Wet gangrene, by contrast, involves superinfection of necrotic tissue with exudate and systemic toxicity. Intravenous fluids and vasopressors would maintain perfusion, while aggressive debridement would be repeated until healthy tissue margins were achieved. The most harrowing aspect, however, is not the technology or the medications, but the psychological terror of feeling one's body eat itself. Medieval descriptions speak of patches of flesh darkening to black, of swelling so extreme that every breath was a struggle, and of a stench so potent it drove caregivers to flee. Modern hospitals, while sterile and sanitized, cannot entirely eliminate the smell of necrosis, though closed suction drains and negative pressure wound therapy would help. Even so, critical care nurses and surgeons sometimes wear specialized masks and hoods when treating severe infections, acknowledging that the odor of putrefaction remains one of medicine's most unsettling sights and smells. For William himself, that terror would have transformed his battlefield courage into a paralyzing fear. In contemporary critical care, compassionate sedation would relieve both pain and panic, allowing patients to rest and recover. Early mobilization protocols, nutrition support via total parenteral nutrition, and aggressive physiotherapy would rebuild strength. Psychological support, including involvement of family members and chaplains, would address spiritual anxieties, recognizing, as William intimately felt, that the greatest horror can be the betrayal of one's own body. In sum, under the lens of modern medicine, William I's story becomes a testament not only to the advances in surgical technique and antimicrobial therapy, but also to our deepening understanding of the human psyche when confronted by internal decay. What was once an inexorable sentence of medieval ignorance could now be met with coordinated, multidisciplinary care. His shedding of mortal coil, from the perspective of today's clinicians, need not have been accompanied by the agony of rot. Instead, his body could have been saved, his spirit spared the ordeal of witnessing its own breakdown, and his legacy preserved without the grotesque epilogue that has haunted history for nearly a millennium. William's death has haunted the collective memory of Europe for nearly a millennium, its grotesque details forming a dark legend passed from chronicler to chronicler. Historians, poets, and filmmakers alike have returned again and again to the tale of the conqueror who rotted alive, his body exploding within a sacred church. This fusion of political brutality and medical horror provokes a mixture of dread and fascination. Few royal deaths can rival the drawn-out agony and profound humiliation that marked William's final days. From the earliest Latin chronicles of Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, through medieval ballads and Renaissance pamphlets, the story grew in both scope and sensational detail. By the 14th century, itinerant minstrels recounted the rotting flesh and the eruption of putrid gases as a moral exemplar. No earthly crown, they warned, could shield a king from divine judgment. Monastic libraries preserved illuminated manuscripts illustrating the bloated corpse and the storm of wings and foul odours that chased mourners through the aisles. In villages across Normandy and England, parents used the conqueror's fate to quiet disobedient children. "Behave," they hissed, "or you may end like William, your father's bones scattered in a leaden coffin." During the Enlightenment, scholars revisited the primary texts with a more critical eye. Yet the grisly core held its grip. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, noted William's death as a frightful spectacle of mortal decay, a vivid reminder that history's heroes are flesh and bone, subject to the same slow betrayals as the humblest peasant. In the 19th century, the Gothic revival in art and literature further elevated the tale. Writers such as Victor Hugo referenced William's final humiliation in passing, using the image of a bursting sarcophagus to signify the fragility of power and the inevitability of ruin. In the modern era, filmmakers and documentarians have seized the story's cinematic potential. The British Broadcasting Corporation produced a documentary in 1972 titled The Rotting King, featuring detailed reenactments of the Siege of Mantes, the fatal saddle strike, and the horrific funeral at Caen. More recently, a French director released a historical drama in 2015, blending CGI effects with on-location shooting at Abbaye-aux-Hommes to recreate the chamber's stench and the priest's panicked retreat. Though these portrayals understandably embellish certain aspects for dramatic effect, they draw upon the same core narrative: a mighty conqueror, undone by corruption within his own flesh. Oral tradition has further mystified the tale. Some local legends claim that on the anniversary of William's death, September 9th, ghostly bells toll at dawn in the courtyard of Rouen Cathedral, even though no living bell ringer may be found. Others whisper that the tide in the Seine carries a faint whiff of decay toward the city, as if the river itself remembers the day the conqueror's body lay fetid on its banks. While such stories lack documentary proof, they reflect the enduring power of the episode in the popular imagination. In academic circles, William's end is analysed as a case study at the intersection of medicine, politics, and theology. Medical historians cite it when examining pre-antibiotic mortality from peritonitis and gangrene. Political scientists note how a king's ignoble demise can delegitimize a dynasty, undermining faith in the ruling house. Theologians debate whether the decimation of the north, when Norman armies starved and slaughtered some 100,000 English peasants in 1069, invited divine retribution, or whether the idea of God's direct intervention is a post hoc, moralizing construct. Today, the rotting king motif serves as a cautionary parable about the limits of power. In leadership seminars and management books, authors invoke William's final humiliation to illustrate hubris and the necessity of moral accountability. Essays on corporate ethics draw parallels between unchecked ambition and the corrosive effect of internal decay, urging readers to remember that external success can mask inward rot. In art installations and immersive theatre, audiences are challenged to confront their own mortality and the transient nature of worldly glory, often with subtle nods to the conqueror's fate. Ultimately, the legend of William's death endures because it speaks to universal fears: the fear of bodily betrayal, of power slipping through one's grasp, and of being remembered not for one's achievements, but for one's failures. Even as modern sensibilities temper the more lurid details, the story remains potent. It stands as a somber reminder that no fortress, no army, no crown can guard against the slow, inexorable processes of decay that govern all living things. In the end, William I, the formidable conqueror, remains inseparable from the spectacle of his own undoing, a lasting testament to the bounds of human ambition and the inevitable triumph of nature's smallest agents. At its core, William's death encapsulates a convergence of terrors and teachings that resonate across the centuries. First, there is the medical horror. The Duke did not die swiftly on a battlefield, but instead endured the agonies of living decay, his own body turning against him. His abdomen, rent by the iron pommel of a saddle, became a chamber of infection peritonitis advancing to both wet and gas gangrene. In an age without antiseptics, anesthesia, or antibiotics, each breath invited fresh trauma. Each movement threatened to rupture yet more tissue. It was a slow, unremitting torment that no sword could cleave and no siege engine could assail. Next comes the social indignity. As William lay dying, his loyal attendants fled his stench, and opportunistic thieves ransacked his quarters, seizing gold chain and jeweled dagger alike. To have one's possessions stolen in the moment of greatest vulnerability compounded the humiliation of physical suffering with the betrayal of those entrusted to serve him. No longer a revered monarch but a rotting corpse, the once omnipotent conqueror found himself abandoned amid plunder, a testament to how swiftly human allegiance can evaporate when fear and revulsion intervene. Third is the political upheaval. The chaotic succession that followed his passing, Robert the Elder inheriting Normandy, William Rufus ascending the English throne, and Henry receiving only a monetary bequest, set the stage for decades of fraternal rivalry. The rigour of Norman rule, honed under William's iron hand, splintered almost at once, as nobles chose sides, rumours spread, and borders shifted. The unity of two realms, secured by conquest, unravelled in the wake of a death that was neither glorious nor orderly, but grotesque and disorderly. Finally, there is the moral lesson. William's life was defined by conquest, from the battlefield at Hastings to the administrative rigour of the Domesday Survey, but his end serves as a stark reminder that all earthly power is fleeting. The robust tactics that toppled kings and the castles that secured territory could not defend against the inscrutable forces of biology. Bacterial invasion, a phenomenon invisible to the medieval mind, proved more formidable than any army he had ever commanded. His physical might, his vast wealth, and the fierce loyalty he once inspired all dissolved in the face of decay and death. This multi-layered tragedy, medical horror, social shame, political crisis, and moral reckoning underscores a universal truth. No matter one's stature, every human life is subject to the laws of birth, aging, sickness, and death. When the organs designed to sustain life become agents of destruction from within, all strategies, weapons, and fortifications are rendered impotent. In a single season of suffering, William, the extraordinary conqueror, was reduced to a fragile vessel besieged by microbes and time. Yet from this grim spectacle emerges a call to humility. We are finite, living at the mercy of our own biology. We cannot outrun the march of decay, nor can we claim absolute dominion over the natural world. William's demise invites us to acknowledge the limits of power and to revere the deeper values that endure beyond the flesh: faith, compassion, and forgiveness. As the stench of his final days faded into history, the lessons remained vivid. Real strength lies not only in dominion, but in the capacity for mercy. Lasting legacy resides not in stolen spoils or castle walls, but in the human bonds of trust and love, ties that neither rot nor ruin can utterly sunder. In remembering William's end, we are reminded to cherish the spiritual virtues that outlast our mortal frames, and to face our own mortality with sober humility and enduring grace. In the centuries following William's ghastly end, the long-term impact of his terrible death became woven into the tapestry of historical record and popular memory. Two of the most esteemed chroniclers of the era, Orderic Vitalis, writing in the early 12th century, and William of Malmesbury, whose Gesta Regum Anglorum reached its final form around the year 1125, both committed to parchment the unfolding stages of William's decay. They described how the fatal saddle strike opened a hidden wound, how his flesh began to soften and blacken, and how, on that fateful day of September 9th in the year 1087, his funeral coffin burst apart in the abbey church, releasing a miasma so foul that mourners fled in terror. Medieval manuscripts that survive today recount that the odour of putrefaction seeped even to the outer courtyard of the Abbey of Saint Etienne, so intense that birds would avoid entering its airspace, and that attendants clamped vinegar-soaked cloths over their noses before approaching the Duke's bedside. This narrative did more than fill annals, it became a staple of sermons and folk tales throughout the Norman realm. Preachers used William's suffering as a moral exemplar. A king who had razed castles at Hastings and ordered the innumerable surveys of Domesday was ultimately undone by his own unchecked violence. Monastic storytellers claimed that in his final hours, William confessed to the priests that his lifetime of conquests and cruelties had summoned this living rot as divine retribution. Meanwhile, villagers in and around Caen spread warnings to one another. "Keep away from the Abbey aux Combes," they would say, for the scent of the conqueror's decay still lingers among the vaulted aisles, even as the abbey underwent repairs in the 15th and 16th centuries. Legends held that the very lead-lined coffin into which William's bones had been placed continued to exhale a faint trace of its original stench, necessitating repeated ritual washings and heavy spicing of the remains. On the archaeological front, intermittent excavations at the Abbey site, most notably during restorations in the mid-19th century, unearthed fragments of the original lead coffin and scattered bone shards. Among these relics, only a single femur was sufficiently intact to merit preservation, now displayed under glass as a haunting memento for visitors. The more ornate 19th century tomb constructed in the restored Abbey o' Homs contained only that solitary thigh bone, encased in a cramped vault meant to symbolically contain the conqueror's legacy, yet few pilgrims dared approach too closely. Most simply knelt at the portal and offered a silent prayer, mindful of the centuries of whispered warnings about the restless echoes of mortality. In modern medical and forensic circles, the case of William I has been re-examined through the lens of contemporary science. Pathologists analyzing descriptions of his symptoms have concluded that the primary pathogen responsible was Clostridium perfringens, the bacterium notorious for causing gas gangrene. This organism thrives in low-oxygen environments, such as a closed abdominal cavity, and produces potent exotoxins that destroy tissue rapidly while generating gas, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide that accumulates beneath the skin. Additionally, the thick adipose tissue that William carried in his later years provided an ideal medium for bacterial proliferation. The humid summer climate of Normandy in July and August would have exacerbated the process, as elevated temperatures accelerate microbial growth and gas formation, increasing intracavitary pressure until the ultimate rupture occurred within the sealed lead coffin. Medical literature now cites William's demise as one of the most chilling examples of autolysis-induced decay ever documented. Autolysis, the self-digestion of cells by their own enzymes, normally commences after death, but in severe gangrenous infection, it can begin prematurely, effectively blending the boundaries between life and death. The combined actions of bacterial toxins and autolytic enzymes rendered William's tissues susceptible to rapid breakdown, resulting in vivid historical accounts of skin sloughing and blistering. Pathological studies emphasize that without modern advances, sterile surgical technique, intravenous fluids, functional anesthesia, and broad-spectrum antibiotics, such an internal wound was tantamount to a death sentence in the 11th century. Thus, the legacy of William's rotting end continues to resonate on multiple levels. We see it preserved in medieval manuscripts, dramatized in popular lore, scrutinized in archaeological digs, and finally explained by 21st century science. The Conqueror's final chapter stands as an enduring testament to the fragility of the human body, the limits of earthly power, and the inexorable processes of biological decay. In pondering his fate, we are reminded that even the greatest among us remain subject to the fundamental laws of nature, a humbling truth echoed by the faint, ghostly whispers still said to drift through the cooling stones of the Abbey o' Homs. The tragic end of William I profoundly reshaped medieval conceptions of royal authority. In the mind of the 11th century populace, a king's sanctity and power were reinforced through ceremony. The resplendent throne, the gleaming crown, the solemn rituals that surrounded accession and burial. Yet William's final rite offered a stark counterpoint. His lead-lined coffin, the ornate stone sarcophagus, and the richly ornamented canopy intended to honor his memory were all rendered impotent in the face of decay. When the coffin split apart amid the tolling bells at dawn on September 9th, 1087, and the bursting corpse unleashed a cloud of fetid vapor, no elaborate liturgy could continue. Clerics fled, abandoning their prayers, and leaving unholy silence where once only reverence had reigned. The spectacle called into question whether pomp and protocol genuinely conferred power, or if they were simply fragile facades unable to withstand the ultimate rupture between life and death. Socially, William's demise marked a critical turning point in loyalty once presumed absolute between ruler and retinue. The same attendants who would have gladly died by his side in battle recoiled in revulsion at the stench of his rotting flesh. Knights of the ducal household, pages, and even monks who had pledged fealty under oath, found their devotion eroded by the instinct for self-preservation. In their collective flight, they demonstrated that allegiance in the Middle Ages, often romanticized as unwavering fealty, was in reality a variable currency. strong when power was visible and felt, but evaporating when faced with personal peril. The fervent loyalty summoned by trumpets and edicts collapsed at the boundary of human revulsion, reminding all that the bonds of service, however solemn, rested on mutual benefit and corporal integrity. Yet beneath these scenes of betrayal and disgrace, a deeper reflection emerged among later historians and theologians. Some interpreted William's living decay, not as simple divine vengeance, but as a moral imperative to safeguard the health and dignity of those who rule. Writing in the 15th century, the chronicler Jean de Waverin argued that a sovereign's body politic encompassed his physical body. Neglecting its care could imperil the entire realm. In this view, William's neglect of personal well-being, whether through gluttony, overwork, or refusal of rest, contributed to his catastrophic downfall. Similarly, 16th century theologians such as Guillaume Boudet examined the conqueror's final weeks as evidence that rulers bore a sacred duty of self-maintenance, both for their own sakes and for the stability of their subjects. They pointed to his construction of formidable castles, the founding of abbeys such as Saint-Étienne at Caen, and the compilation of the Domesday Book as great achievements, yet insisted that these outward monuments could not excuse the neglect of his own flesh when illness struck. In the modern era, the case of William's living decomposition has become a staple in medical history, education, illustrating the pre-antibiotic age's desperate limitations and the devastating potential of unchecked infection. In lectures on the history of surgery, professors describe how a simple abdominal laceration, seemingly minor when covered by skin, could escalate to fatal peritonitis and gangrene without sterile technique or intravenous antibiotics. Courses in pathology highlight the phenomenon of autolysis and bacterial proliferation, using William's story to sensitize students to the urgency of necrotic tissue removal and the life-saving importance of early intervention. Hospital libraries stock reproductions of medieval manuscripts detailing the conqueror's final days, alongside 20th and 21st century journal articles analyzing Clostridium perfringens and other anaerobic pathogens. Documentary filmmakers have likewise turned repeatedly to William's death, drawn by its potent blend of politics, theology, and medicine. The British historical series, Medicine Through the Ages, first broadcast in 1998, devoted an entire episode to The Rotting King, recreating the siege of Mantes, the fatal saddle strike, and the chaotic funeral procession. A French-Canadian co-production in 2014 titled When Kings Rot used forensic animation and expert interviews to show how gas gangrene and wet gangrene would have ravaged William's tissues. Each program emphasizes that the conqueror's suffering transcends a mere footnote in royal biography. It has become a multi-dimensional symbol of human fragility. In sum, William's sensational death has outlived centuries of dynastic change, serving as an unflinching mirror for the limits of ritual, the conditional nature of loyalty, the responsibilities of leadership, and the evolution of medical practice. Though the Abbey aux Hommes stones have long since settled back into silence, the echo of that fetid dawn on September 9th, 1087 endures in monastic records, academic discourse, and the collective imagination. It reminds us that no matter how grand the throne or how mighty the sword, the human body remains subject to decay, and that true power may lie not in domination, but in the humility to care for life's most basic vessel. The grotesque decomposition of William I provoked a profound reappraisal of medieval funerary rites and corpse care practices. Ordinarily, the last act of burial involved opening a coffin to transfer a prepared cadaver into its stone sarcophagus within the church, a ritual that symbolized both reverence and the transition to eternal rest. Yet William's case proved an unprecedented anomaly. His remains, ravaged by peritonitis and gangrene, emitted a stench so overpowering that monks and attendants were unable to perform the standard rite of disrobing, washing, and anointing. Instead, they resorted to hermetically sealing the lead coffin, layering spices and fragrant resins over the body, and saturating its wrappings with wine and medicinal herbs. Chroniclers note that this elaborate, almost surgical mitigation sealing cracks with molten lead, wrapping the entire chest in strips dipped in aromatic oils, and surrounding the corpse with cones of frankincense, marked the first time in Norman practice that focus shifted from honouring the deceased to containing an unbearable odour. Local accounts from Normandy record that jars of funeral water, a mixture of wine infused with rue, myrtle, and other potent herbs were distributed to the townspeople under the belief that it possessed curative properties. Villagers would gather small vials, each seeking relief from indigestion, headaches, or joint pain, convinced that proximity to the decaying conqueror's essence conveyed healing virtues. Some even steeped cloth in this water and pressed it onto inflamed limbs, while others drank teaspoonfuls at dawn, hoping to iron out maladies of the belly. These superstitions illustrate the medieval instinct to seek solace in folk remedies when conventional medicine, bloodletting, herbal poultices, prayer proved ineffectual against internal decay. William's posthumous notoriety did not remain confined to Normandy. Throughout Europe, from England to Italy, and from Spain to the German principalities, merchants and pilgrims conveyed whispered tales of the rotting king. By the early 12th century, troubadours in Provence had begun to weave cautionary verses about a once mighty monarch, undone by corruption within, while English minstrels recounted the harrowing narrative in market squares and castle halls. Even foreign ambassadors returning to their courts carried the story like a potent anecdote. Fragments of blackened flesh, they claimed, were sold in small lead reliquaries, true relics of mortality, to remind rulers and commoners alike that transcendent glory is fleeting and the flesh impermanent. Today, at the Museum of the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen, a dedicated exhibit preserves this macabre legacy. A dimly lit gallery displays a meticulously carved woodcut, depicting the moment the lead coffin burst open, releasing noxious fumes into the vaulted nave. Beside it, a drum-shaped bronze container once used to hold the funeral wine rests on a velvet plinth, its interior still bearing the faintest sheen of dried herb residue. A selection of spice flasks etched with Latin inscriptions of clove, cinnamon, and myrrh stands in silent testimony to the lengths medieval caretakers went to mask the odour. Most striking of all is the solitary femur, authenticated by carbon dating to the late 11th century, and mounted within a glass case. Visitors are advised not to touch it. The label cautions that the artifact remains sensitive to humidity and must be handled only with gloves. As a nod to both history and the visceral impact of William's end, the local tourism board organises an annual Festival of Funeral Fragrance. Held each autumn during the anniversary week of September 9th, this event invites participants to don period attire and attend guided nocturnal walks through the abbey's cloisters. Actors impersonating monks recite excerpts from 12th century chronicles, while herbalists demonstrate the preparation of vinegar-soaked cloths once used to combat miasma. Visitors may sample replicas of the funeral water, though today's blends are tempered by modern hygiene standards. The festival culminates in a candlelit procession to the 19th century tomb, where a single liturgy is chanted, recalling the hushed prayers of those who last tended William's decaying body. Despite its morbid veneer, the festival draws audiences keen to confront the fragility of the human condition. School groups study the intersection of faith, folklore, and forensics, while tourists snap photographs of the lead slab bearing William's name, the Gothic lettering worn smooth by centuries of rain. Scholars convene panel discussions on the evolution of mortuary care, debating whether William's case accelerated shifts toward embalming techniques that would not become widespread until the Renaissance. Local chefs even market a Conqueror's Ale, brewed with dark malts and a hint of cinnamon, sold with cheeky disclaimers about its spirits-lifting properties, though most visitors consume it more as an indulgent souvenir than a remedy. In these layered commemorations, the story of William's rotting death transcends mere historical curiosity. It serves as a conduit between past and present, reminding us of the interplay between medicine, ritual, and popular belief. The Abbey's exhibition, the Festival of Funeral Fragrance, and the enduring legends all underscore how a single dramatic death can ripple through time, shaping customs, inspiring scholarship, and capturing the collective imagination. Nearly a millennium on, the Conqueror's legacy remains etched not only in stone and parchment, but in the very air of Normandy, an indelible echo of mortality that invites all who encounter it to reflect on the tenuous boundary between life's triumphs and its inevitable decay. The psychological dimension of William's living decay reaches into the very core of human anxiety, the fear that one's own flesh might betray its owner. In the centuries since his death, scholars have noted that William's ordeal epitomizes what modern psychologists term a crisis of self, a confrontation between social power and biological vulnerability. Here was a man whose identity and authority were defined by his martial prowess and regal stature, forced to grapple with a foe that no strategy or weapon could vanquish. The microscopic agents of infection that turned his own body into a hostile territory. The external pressures of leadership and conquest, once his defining reality, dissolved in the face of an internal crisis that resisted all attempts at control. Contemporary studies of trauma draw parallels between William's invisible wound and the experience of soldiers suffering closed trauma on the battlefields of modern conflict. In such cases, a service member may bear no visible sign of injury, no bullet hole, no bleeding wound, yet suffer catastrophic internal damage to organs or blood vessels. Military physicians cite William's case as a cautionary illustration. Without prompt detection and intervention, even a seemingly minor, hidden injury can progress to peritonitis or hemorrhage, leading to agonizing death. In this light, William's fate foreshadows the imperatives of modern combat medicine. The necessity of rapid diagnostic imaging, surgical exploration, and resuscitation protocols designed to expose and treat injuries that lie beneath intact skin. Yet beyond the clinical parallels, William's story resonates as a metaphor for existential dread. For a living being to perceive its own body as an enemy territory, where tissue dissolves and odor heralds internal collapse, strikes at the primal fear of bodily betrayal. This is more than physical pain. It is a psychological rupture, the sensation that one's very identity is slipping away as the flesh turns to decay. Psychologists note that such experiences can induce severe panic, depression, and dissociative states, as the boundary between self and non-self becomes porous. In William's case, medieval chroniclers record that he drifted in and out of delirium, haunted by visions of his own dissolution, evidencing an early instance of what today might be classified as trauma-related psychosis. Culturally, the image of the rotting king has inspired a wide array of contemporary artistic expressions. In graphic novels and horror comics, artists have drawn upon William's narrative to explore themes of decay and corrupted authority. One acclaimed series, Decay of the Crown, published in 2018, reimagines a Norman monarch trapped in a nightmarish vision of his own funeral, the lead coffin rupturing in the vaulted church. The panels, rendered in somber sepia tones, evoke both visceral horror and a philosophical reflection on the impermanence of power. Similarly, in speculative fiction, authors have referenced the Conqueror's living decomposition as a template for alien or post-apocalyptic rulers undone by the very biome of their world's testament to how deeply the medieval episode has penetrated modern imagination. Documentary filmmakers, too, have seized upon the psychological horror inherent in William's end. In 2013, a science fiction-styled program titled Anatomy of the Undying interwove CGI reconstructions of his internal organs with interviews from neuropsychiatrists, exploring how the perception of internal betrayal can fracture a person's sense of reality. The program's director explained that William's ordeal offers a powerful entry point for audiences to ponder the fragility of mind and body, how the two are inseparable, and how a failure of one inevitably destabilizes the other. Visual artists, meanwhile, have created installations that place visitors in dimly lit spaces meant to replicate the dank corridors of a medieval abbey, diffusing faint scents of clove and vinegar to evoke the original miasma. Sculptors fashion wax effigies of William's decaying form, complete with sculpted pustules and sloughing flesh, prompting viewers to confront mortality in a starkly tangible way. Some painters favor chiaroscuro deep shadows pierced by single beams of light to underscore the tension between life's fleeting glow and the encroaching darkness of decay. These works often appear in exhibits on power, decay, and transformation, inviting reflection on how even the mightiest individuals are subject to the same biochemical laws as any common creature. Academic discussions at conferences on medical humanities examine William's psychological plight as an archetype of bodily horror. Panels bring together physicians, historians, and literary scholars to discuss how his story illustrates the collision of physiology and identity. They note that his case encourages modern readers to consider how advancements in medicine have relieved some of these primal fears, yet also how new technologies, ventilators, feeding tubes, life support systems create their own forms of psychological trauma, as patients confront prolonged states of semi-consciousness and dependency. Ultimately, the legend of William's living decomposition endures because it taps into universal human anxieties. The dread of betrayal by one's own flesh, the terror of internal collapse, and the destabilization of selfhood when the body becomes a site of uncontainable decay. Through psychological study, dramatic retelling, and artistic exploration, we continue to reinterpret his fate, finding in it both cautionary wisdom and a mirror for our own vulnerabilities. In the quiet hush of a dim gallery or the flickering glow of a documentary screen, William's fate persists as a somber reminder of the delicate equilibrium between mind, body, and the inexorable march of time. And so, as our tale of William's final days drifts into memory, we slow our pace and let the echoes of that distant abbey fade into soft twilight. Imagine, if you will, the long shadows stretching across the cloister stones at dusk, the last candle's flame offering a gentle glow as the world settles into quietude. The thunder of hooves and the roar of flames retreat, replaced by the hushed rustle of leaves and the whisper of an evening breeze through the arches. In this gentle moment, we remind ourselves of the story's true heart, that no matter how mighty our deeds or lofty our ambitions, we are always at the mercy of our own fragile flesh and of the unseen forces that dwell within. William's life, filled with conquest and grand design, came full circle in a lesson of profound humility. It teaches us to cherish health as the truest treasure, to honor compassion above conquest, and to hold fast to the bonds of love and forgiveness that endure beyond any fleeting triumph. Let the image of the bursting coffin dissolve now into soft mist, replaced by the vision of a single, tender candle flickering in the cool, silent corridor. In its gentle light, we find comfort. Our own bodies, though imperfect, are housed in care and warmth, surrounded by friends and family. We breathe in peace rather than fear, knowing that each heartbeat carries us closer to dreams untainted by the burdens of power or the clangor of battle. As you close your eyes, allow these thoughts to cradle your mind. The value of kindness over pride, the quiet power of empathy, the steady grace of a compassionate heart. Let the story's final whisper be one of reassurance that in the soft embrace of sleep, our own bodies find renewal, our spirits find rest, and our souls remember what truly matters. And now, dear listener, may your dreams be gentle, your rest deep, and your waking filled with hope. Sleep well, and when the dawn arrives, carry with you the quiet wisdom of humility and the enduring light of love. If you found comfort in this journey, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that soothe the soul and light the mind. Until our next softly spoken tale, good night, may peace be yours. Whispered, sweet dreams.